Hello. There's been a lot of discussion in the last few weeks in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination about violence, political violence, increasing violence in America. But today I'm not going to be talking about the contemporary violence, but the archaeological evidence of violence before the flood. Uh, in fact, you've probably never seen anything like this before discussed. But here on the left is an example of an antediluvian man with arrows penetrating his breastbone and his skull. This is found in Denmark around 2600 BC. That's roughly the time of the flood. And on the right, you see a man who was likely the perpetuator of some of this violence. You see the beaker is a beer beaker he's holding on in his hands with the and a dagger. And this is by no means isolated because at this time we have archaeological evidence all over the world of violence. Here's a typical skull injury. You can see the cracked in the skull. We'll see a lot of these in the various pictures today. Holes in skull, maybe the axe went across his skull. Here's an example. It's according to the way it's dated at Middle Neolithic, but it's in France, and that it's in the mountain region of France. And the archaeologists have pointed out the great violence here. Now, here's in China, just to read what an academic has said. It says anatomical consideration of cut marks on human bones and the positioning of bodies and body parts within the barrels suggests that mortuary treatment at this site included strategic and systematic disarticulation, evisceration, and excarnation. In Neolithic China has an extraordinary amount of violence before the flood, but so does Europe. Here again, you see in an example from Germany, you see all these spear and arrowheads. they're they're not primarily for animals, but for killing or hunting human beings. Here's some from America. Many of you have heard of the Folsom and Clovis spear points, but these again were used for on human beings. Right here in my own North Carolina, there was it's really from before the flood called the Hardaway culture, and it's known for the extraordinary amount of violence associated with these archaeological sites. And in these prehistoric sites, we have these thick, massive walls. As in the case of these, you see how thick the walls is. That's so they can be fortified. Here's another one from Spain, and here's an example of a prehistoric site. It's really from before the flood. The famous Serpent Mound in the Ohio Valley. But let me explain. This is not artistic work. The Serpentine Mounts is really a prehistoric or antediluvian defense fortification. So there was massive amounts of violence in America, and of course, there's Otzi the Iceman, who was found body still preserved in the Alps back in the 90s, and I'm pretty certain this man drowned in the flood. But the interesting thing that the archaeologists who have studied Otzi, you see in the light green there's a brain injury. There in his back he has evidence of an arrow shot. On his hand, a cut wound. He's got healed rib fractures. So Otzi probably was probably rather typical of the people from this time. He may have been trying to escape, but he was caught in the flood and died. Now, I didn't really. I'm not the one to point out these. I learned them from the from the archaeologists who study these sites. But the evolutionary scholars, they're right now, they're seeing this everywhere, all over the world. And they point to this violence as belonging to the primitive state of man. Uh, the Bible, however, tells of violence as beginning with the first two brothers, Cain and Abel. Cain, jealous of his brother, ends up killing him, the first murder. And then one of Cain's descendants Lamech, he was even more violent. He says, Ada and Zillah, that's his wives, listen to me, wives of Lamech, hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man just for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, and Lamech will be avenged 77 times. And that's the way it goes. Violence creates more violence and vengeance. And in fact, God sent the flood because of this increasing violence. In fact, it's the only, there's a lot of corruption, but the only specific sin that the earth, that God talks about with regard to the flood was the violence. The earth, Genesis 23 and 24. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. And God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on the earth had corrupted ways. So God said to Noah, I am going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of man. I'm surely going to destroy them. So that was the very purpose of the flood. Now, I want to now shift a little bit, instead of talking about the violence per se, showing how I am very confident that these these burials, most of them were created by Noah's flood. Now I'm going to go through a list of reasons, but I'll be giving examples, so you don't have to remember. But one of the first thing is, we have these burial sites, but we don't have any place where people living there were buried, what we call occupational sites, which is an indication that the people are buried in their houses, which, of course, that would have happened in the flood. Then we find all ages buried together, apparently at the same time. Now, that's not the way burials happen in the normal course of things. The older people usually die before the younger people. Most who die are generally older. But aside from the injuries that we see, most of the occupants of the graves appear healthy. And of course, if you got a lot of young people in there, that's a good that shows that probably are healthy. Then the occupants are buried with their things they live with, their personal weapons and adornments, their pottery, things they had, just like they were living. And of course, these now are explained as religious burials, but they were actually just regular burials of people by the flood. Now, unlike historical sites where artifacts are broken or worn out, the artifacts we find in these prehistoric graves that were ended by the flood, they're frequently unbroken, because generally things are not tossed. Things are used until they're worn out or broken. But if we got so many artifacts from this time that are unbroken and in good condition, that's an indication that somebody stopped using them. Maybe there was no one to use them when the people were buried. Then we find burials at campsites and habitable caves. That's where ordinary campsites, in tombs that are built like houses, and necropolis that look like, or they're called necropolis is a term for city of the dead. But these were cities of the living until they were very quickly became cities of the dead. Again, the seventh reason is that unlike formal burials, those where people are laid out generally in a similar position, depending on the culture. But these remains are just buried in all manner of positions, like they were not. You might maybe water swept them in these positions, um, and I mentioned before these structures in low-lying area, and I'll show you an example of that. They're covered by deposits of sand and clay and gravel, uh, forming, or in the ancient Middle East, you have what's called the tails, or in America, you have mounds, and in Russia, you have what's called kurgans. They're houses covered up by the flood. Many, and of course, there are many of these pre-flood used to be just where people live, but they're now in under oceans and lakes, still underwater. And I'll will also be pointing out the large treasures of silver and gold found at many sites, which makes no sense that all this would be left with the dead if people were alive just after these burials. If somebody wanted to leave all this treasures with the dead, somebody's going to quickly steal them. But if there was nobody around to steal them, then which would be happy as an evidence that this of the flood again. And then, as I'll explain, that the skeletons are in. I bought a book on forensics and what is evidence of drowning. And the facts of when one drowns, the arms and the legs are extended upward when they're floating, when the body floats, and then when it finally rests on the floors or grounds or wherever it's resting, it'll be in these flexed position, and I'll be pointing that out. Now, the first here is some archaeologists at a site in the Republic of Georgia that I visited a few years ago. And Dr. Lacelli, Professor Lacelli, was head of the Archaeological Association in the Republic of Georgia. And he's studied a lot of these kurgans that are this is, near southern Russia. And I remember he said to me, we find these kurgans, but we can't find the occupational sites. And of course, at that time, he had not read my book of suggesting that the mounds were the occupational sites. Again, here all ages buried together at the same time. You see these families are all together. The children, the parents are buried together. Here you see an example of some small children. In the upper right, a mother. Oh well, it's a depiction of a mother cradling her child, and then they're buried like that. So this is. I mean, the people have sites are found like this all over the world. Then, of course, they have like they need all these dead people don't need food, yet pottery. These people are found with pottery, and you see again they have the first slide. You saw the bell beakers and daggers. And how these people buried here, they have beads that they're buried with, but they were wearing these when they died. Then, very interesting, in ordinary historical archaeological sites, you find little pieces of pottery which we use to identify various cultures, but you don't have complete pots and things. But in many of these prehistoric sites that obviously are from the flood, you find they're unbroken, like they weren't used out. They weren't, they weren't discarded, but they were still. So there's all types of industries that are just like they were being manufactured, but they're buried up. A lot of archaeologists try to explain these as votive offerings. They're trying to invent a religious interpretation. and you can invent. You can claim that anything is a voting offerings, but these are everywhere. Um, then, as I mentioned, the occupants are found in occupied caves in the upper right, and then the middle lower. Here's an example of caves where people are buried with the ornaments, just like I showed earlier. In the middle upper, there's a campsite, so the people are buried where they would ordinarily be living. These were caves where people, it shows evidence that they lived there. And on the left here, you see a sketch of one of the Native American mounds that was excavated by um, Thomas Jefferson. And really, this is the perfect, this houses at these times would be built just like were buried. Apparently, if somebody can imagine, they built one of these houses strictly as tombs, and then they covered it up with dirt and vegetation. You see trees will grow on it. That doesn't make sense. And then you see on the right, I think this is maybe from Turkey, is a city of the dead that was suddenly covered up. Maybe these houses were built on the side of the mountain, but all of a sudden they were turned into graves. Now, instead of being laid out in formal positions, people are generally buried, from head to foot, but not the case in these. They're just in all types of ways. Now, they may have been swept around by water a little bit, but from the looks of a lot of the people, they may have been trying to hold on to each other. It looks like they were trying to hold on to each other when they died. So we see evidence of this all over the world. And then, as I mentioned before, in low-lying areas, these houses are covered by mounds of dirt, which would have been swept over these houses at the time of the flood. Now, some of them are all shore and the bottom of lakes, oceans, and lakes. So there's a considerable amount of antediluvian archaeological sites just off the shore of the ocean, off Florida, off the coast of Asia, near China, in the Mediterranean, in the Black Sea, and how to get in the bottom of the ocean? Well, a lot of water covered them at the time of the flood. Now, what really clued me into this when I was studying the prehistoric graves was these great treasures of silver and gold. Here's an example of gold in a flood burial in Israel. This is the famous one that the industrialist Henry Schliemann found he thought that at the site of ancient Troy, he believed there were King Priam's treasures. In fact, archaeologists realized these are prehistoric, well before the time of Troy, actually from the time of the flood. Yet there was just tremendous amount of gold that Schliemann and his wife smuggled out of the country, as was done a lot in the 19th century. And then on the right, you see Sir Leonard Woolley excavate what he called the royal tombs of Ur. And in these tombs, he found all these beautiful treasures, of gold and silver. And Woolley was trying to describe how this burial happened, because the king and queen and dancing girls and soldiers apparently were all buried at the same time. And that's when the light came on. I said, "There's a party going on here." When the floodwaters coming in and buried this site, and Woolley announced from this site that he had found the flood because he had found he had dug through some water-laid mud before he got to this site. Actually, this mud is it encloses many of these sites because especially red clay is the heaviest thing, is the first thing to come down at the time of the flood. So he was actually standing in the ruins of the flood when he made this announcement. He's thinking it's a local flood, but in fact it's a worldwide flood. Then the final evidence of my 10 points for why these were obviously from the flood on the flex position, like the example of the bell-bickered man I showed earlier. You see how the legs are bent and the arms are bent. What happens, I found by studying a book on forensics, is evidence of drowning is when you find the people in these flex position, because when the body is floating in the water, the arms and legs are going to extend above, and the torso is going to be bent down. And then when they come to rest, they'll just roll over and it'll be in the position in which the bodies were floating. So this this really, would put the nail in the coffin. There's so many reasons here that would independently point to all these prehistoric sites as being from the time of the flood, but this is one of the most powerful ones. Now, I just want to make this one statement here to my creationist friends. Okay, you haven't found you can't even find the people that died in the flood, because you're claiming that the Ice Age came after the flood. So you're looking at the light of this in a particular science that we're really, when this was created, we're trying to cover up evidence of the flood, and then you're trying to say that the flood are the deeper levels of the earth. Now, those deeper levels may indeed have been created by the flood, but it was not Noah's flood. Noah's flood is at the time of Noah's flood, you got evidence, massive evidence of people, and massive evidence of the violence that took place before the flood. Now, this is really powerful evidence that of the absolute truth of the Bible, and the absolute nonsense that of the current scientific teachings. So it's a great example of returning faith to the Bible. And now let's look at we've been talking about violence. Let's talk about the opposite of violence, which is peace. Here is a drawing of Jesus, the Prince of Peace, which comes from the prophecy in Isaiah. For unto us a child is born, a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. He will be called the Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Then, of course, when he was born, the angels singing glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace on those on whom his favor rests. And then, of course, Jesus himself says, blessed are the peacemakers, because the peacemakers will be called the children of God. And I'm quoting here from the Apostle Paul, said, actually, peace is a weapon. What Satan wants to get rid of peace and divide people. But if we keep our peace, that is the way that Satan and violence is eliminated. And again, I'll quote from the same Apostle Paul in Ephesians. The peace is one of the, we're shod with the gospel of peace, and that, of course, is a spiritual weapon. Now, I want to mention something here about this. The British, he's an atheist, British historian Tom Holland. He's written this book, Dominion, showing how Christianity has made the world more humane. It's a very important book. It wasn't written from a Christian point of view. And as far as I know, Tom Holland may still be an atheist, but he said, I have to look at the facts. And he said, when you look at the world pre-Christian and the world that came as a result of Christianity, even in non-Christian cultures, due to the influence of the Christian cultures, the world has made. I mean, we see a lot of inhumane and a lot of injustice going on right now, a lot of violence going on right now. But if you study history like Tom Holland does, you would see that historically that was the rule of things. But there, to the extent that we have uh, humaneness and peace in the world, you can chalk it up to Christianity, according to this British historian who was not a Christian. Now, I want to end here with just discussing some ways that authentic Christianity, and if it's not authentic, of course, it's not going to make the world more, but how authentic Christianity has made the world more peaceful. First of all, if you read even in the Old Testament, a lot of people say, "Well, yes, it was. This was before Christ came." And they were Israel had a kingdom, and armies and things like that. But over and over in the army, God tells the Israelites, do not depend on the size of your armies. Do not depend on horses, what we call today tanks. Um, but depend on your Lord, and then a small and I mean, the point here is um, peace through strength is not a biblical concept. In fact, it's just the opposite of what is taught in the Bible. Of course, the gospel begins with forgiveness and loving one's enemies. I have a friend from Pakistan, and he was involved in the representing the Christians, or when Christians were attacked, and he called up some of the Islamic really leaders of these madrasas, really powerful men, and he introduced himself, and he got them to work with him. And of course, in when the government couldn't stop these persecutions, but he got some of his Islamic imams, and when they would go to these sites, they were so powerful that the people would shake because they were. The first thing he said when he called them up says, "We Christians, that we believe in love and forgiveness." He was teaching, some of these imams didn't really understand Christianity that well. They've been involved. And in fact, when they would go to one of these sites, they would want to ride with him because a lot of times they were personal enemies, and they could when they got together, they endangered one another. But the gospel teaches forgiveness and loving enemies. Now, of course, unlike Islam, Christ sent out his disciples without staff or sword. In the New Testament, when Jesus commands his disciples not to carry staff, well, the staff is what you use to protect yourself. And there was a time, when he was going to the crucifixion, when he wanted them escaped. So he said that, if you have a sword, you can bring it. But the purpose was for them to be able to get away. And he instructed his disciples, rather than fight, flee persecution. In fact, this is an example, like going back to Isaac in the Old Testament, when there was disputes over his wells, he would just move on and dig another well. But so peacemaking is all through the Bible. In fact, believers, though, there's a reason God has power, or at least the living and present God, and there is supernatural protection. And I know this for a fact. I wouldn't be here. Just time after time, I've been in great danger. I shouldn't. Sometimes from weapons. One time I was hijacked and and at a place where people they were getting ready to kill me, and then some man appeared out of nowhere with a knife to drive them off. But the Lord has protected me many times, and there is protection if we truly have faith and depend on on the Lord. His name is very powerful. Now, by representing everyone, not just one nation, or not, Christians servants can Christ servants can become peacemakers, but if you're gonna be partisan, you can't be that way. But God is the God of all mankind, and so the purpose of Christians, authentic Christians, should be to try to settle disputes, and even beginning within the church itself. Jesus instructs us, if there's problems within the church, to solve these problems. Paul does the same thing. He instructs the Corinthians church to solve. Don't go to the outside world to solve disputes, but settle them yourself. In fact, the most severe punishment that Christ allows the church is excommunicating the repentant. Um, there's not capital punishment is not allowed by the church within the church. The church and also must remain separate from the worldly governments who God appoints to they bear the sword for those who do not fear God. So God appoints these governments; they're needed, and they bear the sword. But that's not the way that the gospel grows in the world. In fact, through the ages, churches and monasteries have served as refuge for those who are in danger, and it was a place that was generally respected. Not being respected, many churches are not being respected right now, but we need to get back where even bad people would respect the church. They would have if our church, if we start showing the real light. And I just want to mention that it was throughout the Dark Ages, the church the church made peace between the kings of Europe. And so you could travel, because of Christians in both countries, you could travel from one country to the other. And that's how what we know of as the West became powerful, because the church, in fact, with the fall of the Roman Empire, the church was the only thing that could hold Europe together. And there was a level of peace. Now, it was not perfect. It was still difficult to keep these kings from fighting, and the Crusades came out of that. But there was, in fact, there was a great advantage that the West had a way of settling disputes without killing one another. And even this nonviolent resistance, even some of those like Gandhi in Egypt and Martin Luther King, they derive from the example of Jesus. So nonviolent resistance is certainly better than violent resistance. I'm not saying that all of it is part of the kingdom of God, but the example of Jesus has influenced other nations. And just if you're familiar with the history, well, the League of Nations and the United Nations, they were originally conceived by Christian missionaries living in these countries, and the war is really hard on Christians, so they conceived of having, now whatever, however they have functioned. I'm not saying that they have been very successful, but the point is that Christ is the Prince of Peace, and He can bring this peace to those who 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 want to be part of it. And His name is a strong tower. Thank you, and peace be with you.